Hello again, Jan from sleepingbaby.net. I've been asked to do a video on sewing a fleece ring sling, and since winter is coming and this is going to be more sort of necessary as it gets cold, here we go. First thing to start out with, fleece is okay for slings with the following caveats. You want to make sure that it's not too stretchy. This is 200 weight micro fleece from Malden Mills. It's what I prefer. It's what I used when I was sewing slings to sell. If you can't get that, try regular fabric stores. You're going to want to feel a lot of them. This is nice because it's not really pilly after it's washed. It's got a good sort of tight knit. Fleece should be stretchy. It'll be a little bit stretchy rather in one direction and almost not at all in the other. So when you're sewing a sling, it's not so much an issue. You're not going to accidentally cut it the wrong way. Usually, I suppose you could go salvage to salvage accidentally, but it would be an awfully short sling. You just want to make sure that the direction of the least stretch is going along the sling and the most stretch is going across. Fleece too is 100% polyester. It is very warm. There have been concerns with fleece pouches in the past that if the baby's face is pressed up into the fabric, it's not very breathable. Not a lot of air goes through, so there is the chance that if your baby's face is pressed into the fabric, or you make a very deep pouch and the baby is just like surrounded by the fabric, that they'll be rebreathing that CO2. Don't let that happen. You shouldn't let that happen with any baby carrier. Your baby's face should always be visible, always clear of the fabric, excuse me, and not pressed into it or into your body. But those are caveats that you'll have with any fabric, not just fleece. It's just a little bit more important with the less breathable polyesters. The other factor is making sure that you use the correct stitch on your machine. If you just use a regular straight stitch, as soon as it stretches, those stitches are all going to pop. So you want to use a zigzag stitch, or if your machine has it, there are often some built-in stitches. And I can't really do that with this camera setup, but there'll be a bunch of built-in stitches for stretches if you have a decent machine, or you can just use that zigzag. And please refer to your sewing machine manual for that. I'll just use a zigzag stitch because pretty much every machine has that in this case. So the first thing you may want to do, and you don't have to, but I think it makes a nicer sling, is hem the edges. And I just have a really short piece here, so I'm just going to do a real quick hem on these. I'm using white thread so it shows up well for the camera. Obviously, unless you really like contrasts, you probably won't want to do that with one that you're sewing for yourself. So I'm just going to fold over, and usually fleece has one sort of nicer side and one less nice side. If it's printed, you may notice that the print is crisper on one side than the other. Just decide which side you want to be the inside and which side you want to be the outside and where you want the hems to fall. If you're using a coordinating thread, the hem really won't show once it's done. Obviously here it's going to because I've got a white thread on black fabric. I would have liked to use a different fabric because I'm not sure that black fabric is going to show the pleats very well, but we'll see. So make sure that you anchor your fabric, your stitching before you start. My machine does that by itself. You may need to play with the stitch a little bit until you get something that you're happy with. Let me kind of zoom in here if I can. I've got a fairly narrow stitch going here. It doesn't have to be super wide, and like you can see, if this stretches a little bit, these stitches stretch with it. And even though it's white, that hem pretty much disappears under the stitches. And that's going to be whenever you're sewing anything with fleece. And what I'm doing is just trying to make sure that when the needle's on the left side, it's just going over that cut edge. If you're using 60-inch wide fabric, and most fleece is 60 inches wide, you'll have one cut side and one selvage edge. So I'll show you the selvage edge next. This is the side that I cut to make it 30 inches wide. This is the selvage edge. It's not usually, whoops, not very in focus. Ooh, really not in focus. I don't think I can do anything about that. It's not usually too visible on fleece as much as it is on a woven fabric. Sometimes it'll be sort of flat. It doesn't have that fleecy texture. You can either cut that off or sew it in. It's personal preference there. I'm just going to do this one a little more quickly. Fleece really can't be pressed So don't bother heating up the iron at all unless you enjoy the space heater factor, I guess. I'm just really kind of folding as I go. If you're not as confident, you can pin and then just pull the pins out as you sew. But fleece is pretty forgiving. So there's that other hem. And now we can start to pleat. So fleece, if you just put it through the rings, it's going to make a super, super thick, like lumpy, hard to use ring end. So what I do in my tutorial is I sew in the pleats and then I cut out some of that excess fabric to make it easier for your machine to go through and also to make it less bulky on your shoulder. So the first thing I'm attempting to do here, which you probably can tell, is fold it in half because the first pleat that I make is just going to be right along the center line. And I think I got the wrong end there. One of these edges is kind of funky compared to the other. Ah, that's better. Okay. So I folded my fabric in half. I've got my two hemmed edges together. And I'm going to measure approximately, assuming I have a ruler, which I don't, I'm going to measure about 2 inches from that center. You can, if you have a ruler on you, then measure about 6 inches down from that as well. So let's see, that's about 6 inches. I'm just going to sort of eyeball 2 inches there. This isn't like super duper critical, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. So I'm about 6 inches from the end here, and I might go 6.5 just to make sewing it in a little bit easier. I'm going to make sure that I anchor my thread and then just sew up to that cut edge. And if you're making, obviously if you're making an actual sling, you'll want to hem the bottom edge too. I just realized I skipped that because this is a really short piece. But hem all the way around. So there's our first pleat. Sewn in. Second pleat, I might just play with this and sort of eyeball it. I'm going to leave about 1 inch between the pleats. So I'm going to fold this so that I have, here's my first seam line. I hope you can see that. Yep. And here's 3 inches from that. It's going to be another 2-inch deep pleat. So I'm going to try and arrange my fabric. You can, do this with rulers and mark with chalk beforehand to be a little bit easier and probably neater. But I'm a spontaneous girl, so I do everything on the fly. Let's see. And then I'm just going to sew another 2-inch pleat starting, and this could be easier if I flip this over. This time I guess I'll go down this way because then I can see my first pleat there. I'm roughly 1 inch from the first one. I'm going to go down and meet it at the same end, which you can't see, but it will. So there's where I stopped the first time. I'm going to stop there for this one too. Basically, you're just going to repeat this on all for about 5 pleats on each side of that center line. So there's roughly 3 inches there. I would recommend marking if you're making this like as a finished actual sling. Oops, I'm getting texts. My husband wants to know if I want a kringle. Yes, yes, please. If you've never had a kringle, see if your Trader Joe's, if you have a Trader Joe's, has one because they're delicious. And the last pleat that I'm going to make is, I think, just going to be 1.5 inches because I don't have enough fabric to go. Well, maybe I do. Yeah, that's 3 inches. Okay, so we can do another 3-inch pleat. Sewn 1 inch away from the second one. This is just basically symmetrical pleats. It's not going to be the same overlapping pleats that I do with woven fabrics. It'll make sense in the end. And then I'm going to do this again on the other end. So I don't know, you can see what I've got so far. Like, whoops, like that. And then I've got one last one to do. Oh my goodness. Yes, both. My husband does the grocery shopping. I'm a lucky girl. That's the hazard of making a video on a Saturday morning. Okay, so last pleat. Whoops, gonna be a mess. Watch what you're doing. Okay. Don't be sloppy like this. Okay, so there's all of our pleats. You are going to want to have a pretty decent machine to make this work, I've got to say. Because even though we're going to cut some of this out, it's still going to be pretty thick where you sew in the rings. So, I'm trying to remember what I do when I do this. It's been a while since I've done one like this. Alright, so this is the good side. The side that you'll see. This is the side that you're going to start cutting. So what I'm going to do is just go about 1/2 inch from where that seam stops, cut straight down, and then just remove most of this material. I'm going to do that for each of these pleats. And this isn't just for fleece. If you happen to be using any thicker material, although, you know, you don't want it too thick for a sling, it's going to be hard to adjust. Fleece is kind of an exception, but you can do this with thicker fabrics. The other thing with wearing a fleece sling while I'm cutting is make sure that your baby doesn't overheat. If you keep the house really cold, or if you're going to be outside for an extended period, this is nice. But babies do overheat fairly quickly. You'll want to feel the back of their neck on a pretty regular basis. If they start getting sweaty, take off a layer from them. Don't use one of these under your coat. Don't put them in a super heavy coat and then a fleece sling. If you keep your house cold and you don't want to bundle your baby up, this is nice. But, you know, just be aware being too hot is not good for babies. So now I've cut out all that fabric and I'm going to start kind of arranging the pleats. I'm going to start with the center one and just kind of squish this so that it's symmetrical. And I suppose I will pin for good form. I'm going to try to pin. Fleece can be a challenge to work with. This next one, you can either squash it again, or you can kind of fold it over to the center. I think in my directions I have you fold it over, but that's going to make a really thick line right there. So unless you have a super duper heavy duty machine, I would squash that one as well. Can you see that? Yeah. Not so good when my hands are in the shot because then the exposure is weird. I think this is going to end up being my longest video. Sorry about the texts. And then this last one, if you squash it, it's going to end up going right to the edge. So this one kind of maybe would fold over, or you can squash it so that it's off center. These others have been centered. This one, I don't know, maybe I'll just squash it. This, you know, you can kind of play with, look at the other side, see what you like. And I think these are not pinning because I'm actually going into nothing on the other side. We'll see. It's been a while since I've done one of these. Just kind of put the instructions up on my webpage and forgot about them, and someone asked recently about it, so yeah. So then you can see on this side how it's going to look. These squashed pleats give you, box pleats, I believe they're called. It has been a while. They sort of open out nicely like that. It does make for a fairly wide shoulder, so if your machine will handle it, squash the first one and fold the others underneath, and it won't spread out quite as much. This will give almost the effect of a gathered shoulder. I gotta grab my rings because I forgot about that. Oh no. This is one of the fabrics that I do like nylon rings for. I feel like it adjusts a little bit easier because it's already so thick. It'll go through these a little bit easier. Boy, is that washed out, but I've got some nylon rings from Sling Rings. These are safe, they're tested. Don't use like shower curtain rings or things that you find at the craft store. That is very unlikely to be safe. I think I'm just going to sew these pleats in real quick before I sew in the rings so they'll stay in place better. And you do want to make sure that you're catching that, remember where we ended the seam? We didn't cut all the way to that, so we want to make sure that we're catching that cut. That doesn't make a lot of sense, I'm sorry. You just don't want to sew past the end of this seam. Maybe that'll make more sense when you see it. This will give you a line to sort of stitch against. Usually I would do this in a basting stitch on a regular sling, but that's just going to tear right out in this. Okay. Take your pins out. Don't want to stab yourself later. And then you don't really need to finish this cut edge. You might want to, in fact, I will tidy this up a little bit so it's not all ragged. Because I'm just going to zigzag right over that. And I think I'm going to increase the width on my zigzag stitch. That's going to, depend on what kind of machine you have, what adjustment mechanism does that. But I'm going to make that fairly wide so that it covers the whole edge. Thread on your rings. Go down a little bit past that line that we just stitched in the pleats with. And then again, because this is fleece, if you're using a coordinating thread, it's just going to blend right into the fabric. You will hardly even see the seam, but this is going to be the underside anyway, so not a huge issue. You could serge this edge and then stitch in the rings too if you wanted to. It is pretty thick, so take your time. Try not to pull as you sew because this is the stretchy direction and you're going to end up with a super duper wide shoulder area if you're also pulling while you sew. Now I'm only going to do 2 lines of zigzag because a zigzag stitch really acts like 2 rows of stitching. It's very difficult to pull out. Here's where the coordinating thread comes in nicely too. You can see where I ended the seams there. If you go back and forth a couple times, you won't have this pulling apart like it is on here. And it also helps, I think, to overlap the edge here a little bit better with where you ended that stitch. Like I should have gone another 1/2 inch that way. But it has been a while since I did this. And then I'm just going to add another row of stitching above that. I wouldn't bother with a decorative stitch on this, particularly if you're using coordinating thread, because it tends to be stretchy and it's not really going to be seen anyway. I hope this makes more sense than pictures. I'm not entirely sure it is. So that's a little bit wider than I would have liked. You can play with the depth of the pleats a little bit and the width of the fabric too, but that's about what we're going for. Let's see if I can do this up a little bit. There we go. So it is super messy looking with the white thread. Use coordinating thread, not contrasting. Of course this isn't really long enough to thread through, but if I did thread it through, you could see that because we cut out some of that fabric from here, you can scrunch this up a lot more than you could if we hadn't cut it out. If we hadn't cut it out, it would be like this, and it would be nearly impossible to thread and adjust. But this will give us enough room in the rings to thread and adjust the tail through. The other thing with nylon rings is you do need to sew a little bit further back from the rings than you do with aluminum rings, just because of this thickness here. It's harder to get the foot on the machine to go any closer than about 3 inches. But that's what I used to do for fleece slings. I think it's what a couple sellers on Etsy still do. If you're buying a sling, I don't know why you'd be watching this, but if you do decide to go and buy a sling, just make sure that they're compliant with existing regulations, which will be changing later in the year, making sure that they're tested and properly labeled and have registration cards. I think that's probably what we need to cover. If you have any questions, please leave them in comments, and thanks for watching. Bye!